Our first writing project in Writer's Workshop is going to be modernizing classic American poetry. Tomorrow we're going to be reading a poem by the famous author Robert Frost, and we're going to be dissecting it together, looking for the different parts or poetic elements. After we read our poem together, we are going to create new poetry that modernizes this classic American poem. So in order to be able to dissect the poetic elements tomorrow while reading, we want to do a quick refresher. So this video is going to go over poetic elements. You can watch this video and go along with your guided notes, filling in the missing pieces so that you can use that as a reference tool later on. Poems are organized with lines and stanzas. Lines are going to look like the sentences of the poem, while stanzas are going to look like the paragraphs of the poem. We use these lines and stanzas to create style with organization. Taking a look at the poem on the left, and later by Jen Bryant, the first line of the poem is, "I take my kaleidoscope off the shelf." The stanza is going to be the first 3 lines. You can see how it's organized to look sort of like a paragraph. The first stanza of this poem is, "I take my kaleidoscope off the shelf, look through the little hole at the end of the cardboard tube." That is the first stanza. You'll notice that the next piece of this poem is a line. You can use lines by themselves and use it to break up the different stanzas. So notice that Jen Bryant has a stanza, 1 line, and a second stanza. Let's talk about organizing the lines of poetry. Sometimes authors like to use enjambment to create an interesting flow and style to their poetry. Enjambment is going to be when you have a line that flows with an idea into the next line and possibly into the third without stopping. This gets rid of what's called an end stop. An end stop is just another word for a period, and a period is at the end of a sentence, and we know that we use that to say that it's complete. If a poem has every single line with an end stop and is basically just a sentence, a sentence, a sentence, a sentence, it gets to be pretty boring, because the whole point of poetry is to have some artistic unpredictability. So instead of just ending every line with basically a period and a complete thought, we can use enjambment to continue that thought in that sentence into the next line and the next. On the right, I have an example of enjambment. Enjambment is the point where a sentence fissures and continues on to the next poetic line. Do you see how the same thought is flowing into the next line? Each line itself is not a complete sentence. That's what we want with poetry. We want a flow. So this enjambment is a great way to make an interesting style in poetry. Next up is rhythm and meter. Not all poems need to rhyme, but all poems need to have a rhythm. Rhythm is a pattern of sounds created by the varying lengths and emphasis given to different syllables. Over here, I have an example of some rhythm in a poem called I Am Iambic. Listen to the pattern of sounds that's created with the length of the lines. Iambic rhythm flows the best. It's fun and will appear on tests. The even numbers please the ear. The 2nd, 4th, and 6th are dear. A line needs rhythm to be sweet. Iambic rhythm can't be beat. Do you see how each of these lines has about the same length to it? This creates a rhythm here. So that's going to make it just fun to read, and also it kind of gets a song-like quality to it with rhythm. Meter is going to be the rhythmic pattern that's created in a line with stressed and unstressed syllables. So let's talk about syllables really quickly. Syllables are how words are separated into sounds. Usually when we're younger and we're starting off with syllables, we clap out the amount of sounds in a word to help identify them. So here I've pulled out a word, rhythm. Rhythm is broken into two sounds, rhythm. So we could clap out the syllable count for rhythm and it would be rhythm. This word has two syllables. So a meter is going to be a pattern that's created in lines with stressed and unstressed syllables. Imagery. Imagery is how words are used to create a mental picture in a reader's mind. When you're using sensory detail and descriptive words to make the reader feel like he or she is there, you're using imagery. Poems that utilize imagery are much more effective in hitting the reader emotionally. So let's take a look at an example of imagery in the poem to the right. C. Collect the flat stones that linger on the beach. Launch each skipping stone against the waves. Liberate the pebbles from the sandy walls. Roll them through your fingers. Plunk them into the water. They will splash your face. Visit with the limpets. Match up the sea stars. Caress the anemones. Listen to the seashells and touch the sunset. There's a lot of things in here that we can picture in our mind. The water splashing into our face, rolling the pebbles between the fingers. This is creating imagery. Next up, we have symbolism. Symbols are objects that represent something bigger than themselves. So here are some common examples of symbols. An eagle can symbolize freedom, represent freedom. An apple could represent knowledge. A four-leaf clover could represent luck. A dove is usually associated with peace, and a tree usually is associated with life. So we can use symbols, objects in our poetry, to help represent something bigger than itself in order to make some type of statement or in order to express our ideas about a particular topic in an interesting way that hasn't been overdone. So taking a look on the right, we have a poem by Shel Silverstein called Diving Board. In this particular poem, the diving board represents something bigger than itself. It's jumping off into the unknown. It's taking a leap of faith. It's trying something new. And so while we have literally a diving board in the poem, also it's representing an idea, something bigger than itself. Symbolism is really fun to play around with in poetry. It makes it unique and special. Something else that makes poetry really unique and special is figurative language. So figurative language is going to be a figure of speech that is not literal. It's not meant to be taken literally. What's being said really actually means something else. So I know that you guys have a lot of history with practicing figurative language, writing figurative language, identifying it. We're going to be diving into figurative language much more deeply in language arts this year. You're going to be learning a lot of new different types of figurative language that are more advanced and that will go to the high school with you for next year. But for now, we're just going to review a couple of pieces of figurative language that I know you're familiar with. Simile, we know, is comparing things using like or as. Metaphor is comparing things without like or as, saying something is something else. Personification is when you're giving human-like characteristics to an object or animal. A hyperbole is an extreme exaggeration of something. Alliteration is when you're starting words with the same letter. An automatopoeia is going to be a sound word, like ah, or woohoo. And an idiom is going to be a common phrase that we use that means something different than what it actually is stating. So for example, I could say, oh, it's really raining cats and dogs out there. It's not literally raining cats and dogs. I'm using that idiom to express that it's raining really hard outside. So those are just a few that I know that you know. And like I said, we will be diving more in depth into figurative language later on. And you guys are going to be learning a lot of more advanced techniques to weave into your work. Okay, we have two more. Diction and syntax. Diction is an author's choice of words and how a writer uses a particular word to create a specific effect. So oftentimes writers will take a long time weighing different synonyms to pick the right word that just fits into the poem and creates an impactful moment for the reader that makes him or her feel something. So Edgar Allan Poe is an example of an author who would spend a whole lot of time really focusing on diction, specific word choice, and how specific words he was weaving into his poetry was going to affect the reader. Syntax is then how those chosen words are organized to create the effect. So here I have a poem that is really fun because it starts off with a mathematical calculation, and then it takes that mathematical calculation and uses very specific words, very specific diction to take that and turn it into a poem. So it's also organized with a syntax. It's organized in a way that mirrors the actual calculation of the mathematical equation. So this one's fun. A dozen, a gross, and a score, plus 3 times the square root of 4, divided by 7, plus 5 times 11, is 9 squared and not a bit more. It's fun. Okay, and our last poetic element for today is strategic repetition. In poetry, repetition is the repeating of words, phrases, lines, stanzas in order to emphasize a feeling or idea, to create rhythm, and or to develop a sense of urgency. This year, we're going to be diving into specific types of strategic repetition, and we're really going to be looking at how does it affect the reader when you end lines with the same word, or you start lines with the same word, or the same line is repeated every stanza at the beginning or at the end, or how does it affect the reader when you have the same word repeated one after another within the same line. So there's different names for different types of repetition, which we'll be digging into deeper later on. But for just right now, strategic repetition is including the same word or phrase or line or stanza throughout a poem. So taking a look at the poem on the left, The Bells by Edgar Allan Poe, has a lot of different types of repetition in it. So you can see that here. We'll be digging into this poem actually later on when we're in Gothic literature in order to apply what we learn about different subcategories of repetition. Okay, so these are the poetic elements that we'll be focusing on tomorrow with dissecting Robert Frost stopping by woods on a snowy evening. So please make sure that if you have any questions, you can send me an email, you can review this video, and please make sure your guided notes are completed at this time. You'll be turning those in on Canvas today, and then you'll be able to use those as a reference later on throughout the school year.